Sometimes the people we love most become strangers to us when life breaks them down. Henry Calder's children watched helplessly as their father retreated into an old school bus after losing everything that mattered to him. At 52, he'd lost his job, his marriage, and seemingly his purpose. His son Michael was embarrassed to tell friends where his father lived. His daughter Sarah worried he was having a breakdown. The neighbors whispered about the man who'd given up on life. But Henry wasn't giving up. Inside that rusty bus, he was quietly building something beautiful. For months, he worked alone, transforming his shame into hope. His family had no idea what he was creating. What happens when they finally step inside and see what their father built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Henry Calder hadn't always been the man hiding in a school bus. 25 years ago, he was the kind of carpenter other tradesmen respected, the one contractors called when they needed intricate millwork or when a restoration project demanded someone who understood how wood wanted to be shaped. His hands, now weathered and calloused from months of solitary work, once crafted custom cabinets for the wealthiest families in 3 counties. Those same hands had built the kitchen where Margaret made Sunday dinners for 23 years. They'd constructed the treehouse where Michael spent entire summers reading adventure novels, and the window seat where Sarah curled up with her dolls on rainy afternoons. Every piece of trim in their old colonial home bore Henry's signature attention to detail, the kind of craftsmanship that made visitors pause and run their fingers along perfectly fitted joints. But that life felt like someone else's story now. The divorce papers had arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a courier who apologized for the inconvenience. Margaret's affair with her yoga instructor had been going on for 8 months, though Henry suspected his heart had known long before his mind accepted it. The revelation came during what should have been their silver anniversary year, a cruel irony that left Henry wondering if any of their shared memories had been real. "I need space to find myself," Margaret had said, standing in the kitchen he'd built with his own hands. "We've grown apart, Henry. We want different things now." Different things. As if 25 years of marriage, 2 children, and a lifetime of shared dreams were simply incompatible preferences, like choosing between coffee or tea. The house went to Margaret in the settlement. Henry's construction job disappeared 3 weeks later when the company downsized, keeping younger workers who didn't mind working weekends or cutting corners on quality. At 52, Henry found himself living in a rented studio apartment, watching his carefully constructed life dissolve like sugar in rain. Michael, now 28 and working as an accountant in the state capital, handled the news with the practical detachment he'd learned in business school. "These things happen, Dad. You'll bounce back. Maybe this is a chance for a fresh start." His wife Jennifer nodded sympathetically while calculating how this might affect their own financial planning. They'd been married 3 years and owned a pristine suburban home where everything matched and nothing showed wear. Sarah, 25, and teaching elementary school in the next town over, cried during their phone conversation, but seemed more concerned with how to explain the situation to her fiancé, Tom. "Are you sure you're going to be okay? Maybe you should talk to someone." There are counselors who specialize in life transitions. Her engagement ring caught the light as she gestured Tom had proposed with his grandmother's diamond, the kind of romantic gesture that belonged to couples who believed in forever. Neither child understood why Henry refused their offers of help. Michael suggested career counseling and networking opportunities. Sarah offered to let him stay in her spare bedroom until he got back on his feet. Both invitations felt like charity, wrapped in the careful kindness adult children use with parents who've disappointed them. The school bus had been sitting in the back field of the old family property for 15 years, a yellow monument to Frank Calder's 30-year career, driving children safely to and from school. Henry's father had died of a heart attack at 67, 3 months after retirement, still planning all the projects he'd tackle once he had time. The bus was supposed to become a workshop, then a guest house, then eventually just became part of the landscape, something everyone noticed but no one discussed. When Henry inherited the property along with 43 acres of overgrown pasture, he'd planned to sell it. The old farmhouse needed a new roof, new plumbing, and more repairs than his savings could handle. But something about that bus called to him during his first visit after the funeral. Maybe it was the way morning light streamed through the dusty windshield, or how solid it felt when he climbed inside and sat in his father's driver's seat. Frank Calder had been a quiet man who understood the value of steady work and keeping promises. Every school day for 3 decades, he'd arrived at the bus barn at 6:30 in the morning, conducted his pre-trip inspection with the thoroughness of an aircraft mechanic, and then spent the next 3 hours ensuring that every child in his care reached their destination safely. Parents trusted him with their most precious cargo because Frank Calder had never had an accident, never missed a day, except for his father's funeral, and never raised his voice at the children who tested his patience. A man's character shows in how he handles responsibility when no one's watching, Frank used to tell Henry. Anyone can do right when there's an audience. The old toolbox sat exactly where Frank had left it, tucked behind the driver's seat. When Henry opened it, the scent of machine oil and honest work brought tears he hadn't expected. Inside were tools that had built half the barns in the county hand plains, smoothed by decades of use, chisels sharp enough to shave with, measuring devices calibrated by experience rather than digital readouts. These weren't the power tools Henry had relied on in recent years, the kind that did the work quickly but left no room for the meditative rhythm of traditional craftsmanship. These were tools that demanded patience, that rewarded skill, that connected a craftsman to generations of men who'd understood that building something meant more than just putting pieces together. Henry moved into the bus on a Thursday in late September, bringing only what fit in his pickup truck. The children learned about his decision through a neighbor who mentioned it at the grocery store. Michael drove out the following weekend with Jennifer in tow, both wearing expressions of barely concealed horror as they approached the yellow school bus parked behind a farmhouse that looked like it belonged in a documentary about rural poverty. "Dad, this is temporary, right?" Michael had asked, standing outside the bus but not entering. "You're not seriously planning to live here permanently?" Jennifer clutched her purse tighter and scanned the property for signs of indoor plumbing. "Maybe we could help you find a nice apartment closer to town. Somewhere with, modern conveniences." Henry had invited them inside, but the bus still looked like what it was, a stripped-down vehicle with bench seats and institutional green paint. The bathroom was barely functional, the sleeping area was a cot wedged between wheel wells, and the kitchen consisted of a hot plate and a cooler. He could see his son's embarrassment growing with each detail. "I'm fine here," Henry said, though even he wasn't sure if that was true. "Your grandfather always planned to fix this old girl up. Seems like the right time to honor that." Sarah visited the following week, bringing homemade cookies and the kind of bright optimism elementary school teachers use to manage difficult situations. She lasted longer than Michael, actually sitting on one of the bench seats and asking questions about his plans. But Henry could see her calculating how to explain this to Tom's parents, who were prominent members of the country club and had strong opinions about family reputation. "Maybe you could think of this as a project," she'd suggested carefully. "Something to keep you busy while you figure out your next steps. But Dad, you can't actually live here long term. People are starting to talk." People were indeed talking. Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the house closest to the property line, mentioned to everyone at church that Henry Calder was going through a rough patch and living in that old bus like some kind of vagrant. The story grew with each telling until Henry became the subject of whispered conversations about mental health and what happened to men who couldn't handle modern life. But inside the bus, something different was happening. Henry had begun to see possibilities where others saw only problems. The long interior could become a flowing living space if he removed some seats and reconfigured the layout. The high ceiling offered room for storage and maybe even a loft area. The large windows, once they were properly cleaned and sealed, would provide natural light and views of the pasture where his father had once talked about raising horses. Most importantly, the bus represented something that belonged entirely to him. No mortgage payments to ex-wives, no landlords with rules about modifications, no homeowners associations dictating what colors he could paint the trim. For the first time in months, Henry felt the familiar stirring that came when he looked at raw materials and saw the finished project waiting inside. He started with the basics, cleaning, organizing, making the space livable while he planned the real transformation. Each morning, he woke before sunrise and worked until his hands ached, driven by a purpose he couldn't yet articulate. The work felt like prayer, like meditation, like the conversations with his father he'd never had time for when Frank was alive. Winter was coming, and Henry knew he needed to winterize the bus properly if he planned to stay. But as October painted the maple trees in shades of gold and crimson, he found himself thinking less about survival and more about creation. This wasn't just about having a place to sleep, this was about building something worthy of the man his father had raised him to be. The toolbox sat open beside him as he worked, Frank's tools ready for the hands of another generation. Henry could almost hear his father's voice in the whisper of the hand plane, the tap of the chisel, the satisfaction of joints that fit so perfectly they seemed to have grown together. His children thought he'd given up on life. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. But Henry Calder was just getting started. The legal papers arrived on a grey November morning, delivered by the same courier service that had brought Henry his divorce decree 8 months earlier. This time, the envelope contained wedding invitations, elegant cream cardstock, with Margaret's name printed alongside that of David Chen, the yoga instructor who had helped her find herself. Henry sat in the driver's seat of the bus, holding the invitation with hands that trembled slightly from the cold morning air. The wedding was scheduled for December 15th at the Riverside Gardens, the same venue where he and Margaret had celebrated their 10th anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on him, though it cut deeper than he'd expected. Margaret Calder and David Chen request the pleasure of your company. The formal language felt like a slap, especially the way his surname still appeared beside another man's name. Had she kept it for convenience, or was this some final twist of the knife? Henry folded the invitation carefully and set it on the dashboard, where it caught the morning light streaming through the windshield. He'd been expecting this, of course. The divorce had been final for months, and Margaret had moved in with David shortly after the papers were signed. But seeing it printed in elegant script, knowing that she was building a new life with the kind of celebration they'd once shared, brought back the hollow ache he'd been trying to work away. Henry climbed out of the driver's seat and walked toward the back of the bus, where he'd been slowly clearing out the old bench seats. The physical work usually helped quiet his mind, but today his hands felt clumsy, disconnected. He picked up a wrench and immediately dropped it, the metal clanging against the bus floor with a sound that echoed like a bell. That's when he saw it, a glint of gold, wedged between two seat-mounting brackets. Henry knelt and worked his fingers into the narrow space, pulling out Margaret's wedding ring. The simple gold band he'd saved for months to buy, the ring she'd worn for 23 years before setting it aside like everything else from their marriage. She must have lost it during one of her visits to collect personal items. Henry remembered that day, Margaret moving through the old farmhouse like a stranger, packing up photos and keepsakes while avoiding eye contact. She'd seemed nervous, eager to finish quickly and leave. The ring must have slipped off during the hurried packing, rolling into a crevice where it had waited all these months to surface. Henry held the ring up to the light, watching the way it caught the morning sun. 23 years of marriage reduced to 14 grams of gold. He thought about calling Margaret to let her know he'd found it. But what would be the point? She had a new ring now, probably something more modern that reflected her new life with David. The phone calls came that afternoon, both children reaching out with the awkward concern that had become their standard approach to dealing with their father's situation. "Dad, we heard about Margaret's wedding." Sarah said, her voice careful and measured. "Are you okay? Maybe you should come stay with me for a few days, just until after the holidays." Michael was more direct. "This can't be good for your mental health, Dad, living out there alone, dealing with all this stress. Jennifer thinks you might benefit from talking to someone professional. We know a counselor who specializes in men going through life transitions." Both conversations felt like interventions, as if his children had rehearsed their approaches. Henry appreciated their concern, but he could hear the underlying message. Their father was broken, possibly unstable, and definitely an embarrassment that needed to be managed. "I'm fine," Henry told them both, though he wasn't sure that was true. "I have plenty to keep me busy here." After the phone calls ended, Henry sat in the gathering dusk and made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to spend the winter feeling sorry for himself, watching his life dissolve, while his ex-wife celebrated new beginnings. The bus wasn't going to be a refuge from his problems, it was going to be his declaration of independence. Henry pulled out a yellow legal pad and began sketching, not just plans for making the bus livable, but designs for something extraordinary. If Margaret wanted to start fresh with someone new, fine. If his children thought he'd given up, they were about to learn otherwise. And if the neighbors wanted something to talk about, Henry would give them a story worth telling. The sketches flowed from his pencil like they'd been waiting inside him all along. A living room where the front seats used to be, with built-in seating and storage. A galley kitchen that maximized every inch of space. A bedroom that could be private yet open, comfortable yet efficient. This wasn't about survival anymore, this was about creating something beautiful. Henry walked to his father's toolbox and lifted the lid, breathing in the familiar scent of machine oil and honest work. Frank Calder's tools seemed to gleam in the fading light, as if they understood they were about to be put to their proper use again. These tools had built barns and houses, cradles and coffins, all the furniture that marked the important moments of rural life. Now they would help Henry build something that had never existed before, a rolling home that combined traditional craftsmanship with modern needs, a space that would prove he was far from finished with life. He picked up one of his father's hand planes and tested the blade against his thumb. Still sharp after all these years, maintained with the care Frank brought to everything he touched. Henry could almost feel his father's presence as he held the tool, could almost hear Frank's voice, offering the patient guidance he'd provided when Henry was learning the trade. "Measure twice, cut once," Frank used to say, "and remember, son, the wood will tell you what it wants to be if you listen carefully enough." Henry spent the evening going through every tool in the box, reacquainting himself with implements he hadn't used in years. The power tools that had made him efficient had also made him lazy, he realized. These hand tools demanded attention, skill, and patience, qualities he'd need for the project taking shape in his mind. When he finally tried to sleep that night, Margaret's ring sat on the small table beside his cot, catching moonlight from the cleaned windows. Tomorrow he would begin the real work, but tonight he allowed himself to remember the good times, Sunday mornings when Margaret made pancakes in the kitchen he'd built, evenings when the children played in the backyard while he worked on small projects in his shop, holidays when their house felt like the center of a universe that made sense. Those memories didn't hurt anymore. Instead, they felt like fuel for what was coming next. Henry had learned to build beautiful things once before, for people who had loved and left him. Now he would build something beautiful for himself, something that would last as long as he had breath to maintain it. The invitation remained on the dashboard, a reminder of endings. But beside it, the yellow legal pad filled with sketches represented something else entirely, the first evidence of a beginning that would surprise everyone who thought Henry Calder had nothing left to give. Margaret could have her garden wedding and her new life. Henry was about to create something that would make his old life look like a rough draft. The first serious work began on a Monday morning when frost still clung to the bus windows and Henry's breath formed clouds in the cold air. He'd spent the weekend finalizing his plans, measuring every inch of interior space, and calculating how to transform a vehicle designed to transport children into a home worthy of the man his father had raised him to be. Henry started where all good projects begin, with demolition. The old bench seats had to go, along with decades of accumulated dust, rust, and the institutional smell of countless school mornings. Each seat required careful removal to avoid damaging the floor or structural elements he'd need later. The work was methodical, almost meditative, giving him time to think about what he was really building here. As he unbolted the third row of seats, memories surfaced of teaching Michael basic woodworking when the boy was 8 years old. They'd been building a birdhouse in the garage workshop, Henry guiding small hands as they learned to use a hammer without mashing fingers. Michael had been so proud of that crooked little house, insisting they mount it where he could see it from his bedroom window. "Why do we have to measure so many times, Dad?" Michael had asked, frustrated with the precision Henry demanded. "Because once you cut the wood wrong, you can't uncut it," Henry had explained. "Taking time at the beginning saves you from disappointment at the end." Now, 20 years later, Henry wondered if he'd been too focused on the precision and not enough on the joy. Michael approached everything with the same careful calculation these days, but there was no playfulness in it anymore, no wonder at the process of creating something from nothing. The seats yielded their bolts with the protest of old metal, but Henry's father's tools made the work almost pleasant. Frank's socket wrenches fit perfectly, and the leverage was exactly what Henry remembered from childhood projects in the barn. These tools had been made when manufacturers expected them to last a lifetime, when the weight of solid steel in your hand meant something about the quality of the work you could do. By noon, Henry had cleared the front half of the bus and could see the potential taking shape. Without the seats, the space felt enormous, a blank canvas 35 feet long and 7 feet wide, with 8-foot ceilings that seemed impossibly generous after months of living in cramped quarters. The windows, once cleaned properly, would provide natural light and views of the pasture where his father had once talked about raising horses. Henry was examining the electrical system when he heard a car door slam outside. Through the windshield, he could see Michael's sedan parked beside his pickup truck, with Jennifer sitting in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone. Michael approached the bus with the careful expression he wore when visiting elderly relatives in nursing homes, polite, concerned, and slightly horrified. "Dad," Michael called out, not quite willing to board the bus uninvited. "Are you in there?" Henry wiped his hands on his work shirt and stepped outside, noting how Jennifer remained in the car despite the pleasant afternoon weather. "Michael, this is a surprise. Jennifer and I were driving back from her parents' place, and I thought we should check on you." Michael glanced around the property with the quick assessment of someone calculating property values. "How are you holding up? We heard about Margaret's situation." The careful phrasing didn't hide what Michael really meant. His father was living in a school bus, his ex-wife was remarrying, and the whole situation reflected poorly on the family's stability. Henry could see the concern warring with embarrassment in his son's eyes. "I'm doing well," Henry said, gesturing toward the bus, "making good progress on the renovation. Want to take a look?" Michael's reluctance was obvious, but he followed Henry inside. Jennifer remained in the car, having found something urgent to attend to on her phone. The interior stopped Michael short, not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. Where he'd expected chaos and evidence of his father's declining mental state, Michael found systematic progress and careful planning. "You're actually gutting the whole thing," Michael said, surprise evident in his voice. "Complete renovation," Henry confirmed. "New electrical, plumbing, insulation, interior systems. It's going to be a real home when I'm finished." Michael walked the length of the bus, his accountant's mind calculating costs and logistics. "Dad, this is a massive undertaking. The electrical alone will cost thousands, and that's assuming you can get permits for this kind of conversion. Have you thought about the practical aspects? Resale value? Zoning regulations?" There it was, the practical concern that had replaced wonder in his son's approach to life. Michael saw problems where Henry saw possibilities, obstacles where Henry saw opportunities for creative solutions. "I'm not worried about resale value," Henry said. "I'm not building this to sell." "But Dad, be realistic. You can't live in a school bus forever. What about when you get older? What about your retirement? This isn't a sound investment of your time or money." Henry felt the familiar frustration that came when talking with his children these days. They meant well, but they'd lost the ability to see beyond immediate practical concerns. When had Michael stopped believing in the possibility of creating something extraordinary? "Your grandfather kept this bus for 15 years, planning to do something special with it," Henry said. "I'm finally honoring that plan." Michael softened slightly at the mention of Frank. "Grandpa was different, Dad. He grew up in a time when people had to make do with what they had. You have options now. You could get a nice apartment, maybe find some part-time work to keep you busy." The visit ended with awkward promises to stay in touch, and Michael's suggestion that Henry think carefully about his next steps. Jennifer waved from the car but never left her seat. As they drove away, Henry could see them talking intently, probably planning their next intervention. Alone again, Henry returned to the bus and found Frank's old driver's badge tucked behind a seat-mounting bracket. The metal shield was tarnished, but still bore his father's name and 30 years of service dates. Frank Calder had driven this route faithfully, carrying other people's children safely to their destinations, never missing a day except for his own father's funeral. Henry polished the badge with his shirt sleeve until it gleamed, then propped it on the dashboard where he could see it while he worked. Frank had understood duty and service, had taken pride in doing ordinary work extraordinarily well. The badge represented something valuable that Michael's generation seemed to have lost, the satisfaction of building something lasting with your own hands. The afternoon light was fading when Henry returned to his demolition work, but he felt energized rather than tired. Michael's visit had clarified something important. This project wasn't about proving anything to his children or ex-wife or neighbors. This was about honoring the man his father had raised him to be and creating something worthy of the tools and wisdom Frank had passed down. The bus would become a masterpiece, not because others expected it, but because Henry's hands remembered what it felt like to create something beautiful. December arrived with an early snowfall that turned the old bus into a yellow island in a sea of white. Henry had established a routine that began before sunrise and continued until his hands ached from the cold. Coffee first, brewed on his camp stove while he studied his plans by lamplight, then outside to split kindling for the small wood stove that kept the bus barely warm enough for detailed work. The demolition phase was complete, revealing the bus's skeleton in all its utilitarian beauty. The framework was solid, built in an era when school buses were constructed to last decades rather than planned obsolescence cycles. Henry had stripped the interior down to bare metal and begun the process of insulation, electrical rough-in, and the careful measuring that would determine every subsequent decision. His daily routine had become a form of meditation. Each morning, he'd examine yesterday's progress and plan the day's tasks. The work demanded absolute precision. A quarter-inch error in framing would compound throughout the entire project. But Henry found peace in the exactitude, in the way traditional craftsmanship demanded his complete attention and left no room for dwelling on Margaret's wedding plans or his children's concerns. The kitchen area was taking shape first, a galley design that maximized every inch of available space. Henry had designed custom cabinets that would utilize the wheel wells as structural support while hiding the mechanical necessities of bus life. Each piece required careful calculation of weight, stability, and access challenges that modern home construction rarely presented. He was hand-fitting a cabinet door when the phone rang, Sarah's number appearing on the small screen of his flip phone. Henry wiped sawdust from his hands and answered, already knowing this wouldn't be a casual conversation. "Dad, I'm worried about you," Sarah began, skipping any pretense of small talk. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned to Mom Reynolds at church that you're living in that bus full-time now, even with winter coming. That can't be healthy." Mrs. Patterson, the nearest neighbor, had appointed herself the unofficial monitor of Henry's situation. She'd been reporting his activities to anyone who'd listen, turning his quiet project into neighborhood gossip. "I'm fine, Sarah. The bus is warmer than you'd think, and I'm making good progress on the renovation." "But Dad, what's the end game here? You can't seriously plan to live in a school bus permanently. What are you trying to prove?" Henry set down his hand plane and considered the question. What was he trying to prove? That he wasn't broken? That Margaret's betrayal hadn't defeated him? That a man could start over at 52 and create something beautiful from the ruins of his old life? "I'm not trying to prove anything," he said finally. "I'm trying to build something worth building." Sarah's sigh carried clearly through the phone. "Tom and I have been talking, and we think you might be having some kind of delayed reaction to the divorce. It's normal, Dad. But isolation isn't the answer. You should be around people who care about you." Tom, Sarah's fiancé, who sold insurance and played golf every Saturday at the country club. A perfectly nice young man who'd never built anything more complex than IKEA furniture and couldn't understand why anyone would choose manual labor over hiring professionals. "How is Tom?" Henry asked, deflecting slightly. "He's wonderful. Actually, he's been asking about you. He grew up around tools, his grandfather was a contractor, and he's curious about what you're working on. Maybe he could come visit sometime, see what you're building." This surprised Henry. Sarah's previous visits had been brief inspections focused on his welfare rather than his work. The idea that Tom might actually be interested in the craftsmanship was unexpected. "He's welcome any time," Henry said, meaning it. After Sarah hung up, Henry returned to his cabinet door, testing the fit of mortise and tenon joints cut entirely by hand. The precision was satisfying in a way that power tools never achieved. The whisper of sharp chisel through hardwood, the perfect mating of pieces cut to thousandths of an inch tolerances. The work reminded him of a project from Sarah's childhood, a jewelry box he'd made for her 8th birthday. She'd watched him craft tiny dovetail joints for the drawers, fascinated by the process of creating something beautiful from rough lumber. Her attention had been complete then, unmarked by the skepticism that colored their adult conversations. "Why do you make it so fancy, Daddy?" she'd asked, watching him hand-cut decorative inlays. "Nobody will see the inside parts. Because I'll know they're there," Henry had explained. "And someday, when you're grown up, you'll open this box and remember that your dad cared enough to make every piece perfect, even the parts nobody sees." Henry wondered if Sarah still had that jewelry box, if she'd ever opened it as an adult and remembered his words about hidden craftsmanship. Probably it was packed away in some closet, a relic of childhood that no longer fit her modern aesthetic. The afternoon brought unexpected company when a pickup truck pulled into the drive. Henry didn't recognize the vehicle, but the man who climbed out looked familiar, weathered face, work boots, and hands that bore the calluses of someone who still made his living with tools. "You Henry Calder?" the man asked, approaching the bus with obvious curiosity. "That's right. Name's Bill Patterson. I live about 2 miles down the road. My wife's been mentioning your project, and I had to come see for myself. Hope you don't mind the intrusion." Henry gestured toward the open bus door. "Not at all. Come take a look." Bill stepped inside and immediately understood what he was seeing. His eyes took in the careful framing, the precise electrical work, the custom joinery that spoke of serious craftsmanship. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "This is real work." For the next hour, the two men discussed techniques, materials, and the challenges of converting a vehicle into living space. Bill had restored 3 antique trucks and understood the complexities of working within existing structures. More importantly, he appreciated the level of skill Henry was bringing to the project. "Most people would just throw up some paneling and call it done," Bill observed, running his fingers along a hand-fitted joint. "This is furniture-grade work." When Bill left, he carried with him a completely different story than the one Mrs. Patterson had been spreading. Henry wasn't a broken man hiding from reality. He was a master craftsman, creating something extraordinary. The distinction would matter more than Henry realized. That evening, as snow began falling again outside the bus windows, Henry worked by lamplight on a special project. Using wood salvaged from the old bench seats, he was crafting a picture frame, not just any frame, but one worthy of the last happy photograph of his family. The image, taken the Christmas before everything fell apart, showed all four of them gathered around the tree in the living room Henry had built. The frame required delicate carving, traditional joinery, and a finish that would last generations. As Henry worked, he thought about the hidden craftsmanship Sarah had questioned years ago. This frame would hold memories that mattered, created with care that nobody else would see, but that would endure long after he was gone. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the bus, something beautiful was taking shape, one careful cut at a time. January brought the kind of bitter cold that tests both resolve and heating systems. Henry's wood stove worked overtime to keep the bus interior warm enough for detailed work, and his breath still formed clouds when he worked on projects requiring fine motor control. But the cold had an unexpected benefit. It drove him to seek materials from heated indoor sources, leading to discoveries that would transform his simple renovation into something approaching art. The demolition of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church had been scheduled for months, but the weather delayed the wrecking ball until mid-January. Henry learned about it from Bill Patterson, who mentioned that the church council was selling architectural salvage to help fund their new building. When Henry arrived at the church on a grey Thursday morning, he found treasures that spoke to both his craftsman's eye and his deeper spiritual needs. The stained glass windows were the first pieces to catch his attention. Installed in 1924, they depicted traditional religious scenes in jewel tones that caught even the weak winter light and transformed it into something precious. The church council had priced them to sell quickly, more concerned with clearing the building than maximizing profit. "Nobody wants these old things anymore," the council chairman explained apologetically. "The new church will have modern windows, easier to maintain, better energy efficiency. These are beautiful, but they're not practical for contemporary worship." Henry examined the windows with the careful eye of someone who understood both artistry and structural engineering. The lead cames were in good condition, the glass was intact, and the craftsmanship represented skills that had been dying out for decades. More importantly, these windows had been blessed by the prayers and hopes of generations of faithful people. They deserved better than the demolition dumpster. He bought 6 panels for less than the cost of a single modern replacement window. Back at the bus, Henry began the delicate process of measuring and planning how to incorporate stained glass into his mobile home's design. The bus's existing windows were functional but institutional, large panes of clear glass that provided light and views, but no beauty. By carefully replacing selected sections with stained glass panels, Henry could create something that had never existed before, a rolling chapel that would carry sacred art wherever it traveled. The work required skills he'd learned decades earlier during a brief apprenticeship with a master glazier. The memory came flooding back as he handled the ancient tools, the lead knife for cutting cames, the glazing compound that sealed glass to frame, the patience required to work with materials that had been perfected centuries before. Mass production changed how things were made. As Henry worked, he thought about the countless Sunday mornings when these windows had filtered morning light across wooden pews, filled with people seeking comfort, guidance, and community. Now they would filter that same light across his morning coffee, his evening reading, his quiet moments of reflection about the direction his life was taking. The first panel took 3 days to install properly. Henry had to modify the bus's window frame without compromising its structural integrity, create weather-tight seals that would withstand highway speeds, and ensure the stained glass was protected from road vibration. When he finally stepped back to admire the completed installation, the transformation was breathtaking. The panel depicted the parable of the mustard seed, a tiny seed growing into a tree large enough to shelter birds. As afternoon light filtered through the ancient glass, it painted Henry's work area in blues and golds that seemed to bless the humble space with something approaching sanctity. The bus was no longer just a vehicle or a home, it was becoming a sanctuary. Word of Henry's project was beginning to spread beyond Mrs. Patterson's gossip network. Bill Patterson had mentioned it to his brother, who worked at the hardware store, and mentioned it to customers who appreciated fine craftsmanship. The story was changing as it spread. Henry wasn't hiding from reality. He was creating something extraordinary that combined traditional skills with innovative vision. The attention brought unexpected visitors. A retired carpenter named Ed Morrison drove out from town specifically to see Henry's work, bringing his grandson along to witness craftsmanship that was becoming rare in an age of mass production. Boy needs to see how things were really built. Ed explained to Henry as they examined the stained glass installation. Everything now is particle board and hot glue. Kids never seen real joinery. The grandson, maybe 16 years old, seemed more interested in his phone than in Henry's work, until Ed pointed out details that revealed the complexity of the project. How the electrical system was routed to avoid interfering with the stained glass. How the window modification actually strengthened the bus's frame rather than weakening it. How every joint was cut to tolerances that eliminated the need for caulk or filler. My grandfather's generation built things to last forever, Ed told the boy. Mr. Calder here is carrying on that tradition. 20 years from now, this bus will still be solid, while everything else from this decade will be falling apart. Henry felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wood stove. Ed's words carried the weight of professional recognition, one craftsman acknowledging another's skill. It had been months since anyone had seen Henry's work as anything more than an eccentric old man's desperate attempt to avoid reality. The boy asked unexpected questions about the tools Henry was using, the difference between hand-cut and machine-cut joints, why someone would choose more difficult methods when easier ones were available. Henry found himself explaining concepts he'd learned from his own father, how the process was often as important as the result, how patience and precision created satisfaction that shortcuts could never provide. You could probably sell these, the boy suggested, examining the stained glass installation. I bet people would pay a lot for custom work like this. Henry smiled at the young man's entrepreneurial thinking, but shook his head. This isn't about making money, it's about making something worth making. After Ed and his grandson left, Henry returned to work on the second stained glass panel, this one depicting Daniel in the lion's den. As he carefully fitted the ancient glass into its new home, he thought about the story's meaning. Daniel had maintained his faith despite impossible circumstances, trusting that doing right would eventually be rewarded, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Maybe that's what Henry was doing here in the bus, maintaining faith that patient work and honest craftsmanship would create something meaningful, even when his children and ex-wife thought he'd lost his mind. The stained glass would bear witness to that faith, transforming ordinary bus windows into portals for sacred light. Outside, snow continued to fall on the pasture where his father had once planned to raise horses. Inside the bus, Henry worked by the colored light of centuries-old glass, creating something that honored both the past and the future, a rolling masterpiece that would carry the best of traditional craftsmanship into whatever came next. February brought a thaw that turned the pasture into muddy channels, but inside the bus, Henry was creating order from what had once seemed like chaos. The stained glass windows now cast rainbow patterns across his work surfaces, transforming even the most mundane tasks into something that felt blessed. But it was a small wooden box that would challenge his skills in ways he hadn't anticipated. Margaret's recipe box had been sitting in a corner of the bus since December, overlooked among the boxes of salvaged materials and surplus belongings. Henry had almost thrown it away several times, viewing it as another painful reminder of their failed marriage. But something about the box's solid construction had stayed his hand. It was made from cherry wood, with dovetail joints and a patina that spoke of decades of faithful use. Opening it had been a mistake, or maybe a necessary step in his healing. Inside were hundreds of index cards in Margaret's careful handwriting, documenting 25 years of family meals. Sunday pot roast recipes, birthday cake variations, holiday cookies that the children had helped make when they were small enough to stand on chairs and measure ingredients with serious concentration. Henry's favorite meatloaf was written on a card stained with sauce spatters from countless preparations. Sarah's celebration pancakes included notes about serving them with fresh strawberries and whipped cream for special occasions. Michael's study snacks listed the combinations of nuts and dried fruit that had fueled late-night homework sessions. Each card told a story of family life that had once seemed permanent. Looking through them, Henry could almost smell cinnamon rolls baking on Christmas morning, could almost hear the laughter that had filled their kitchen during holiday preparations. The recipes weren't just instructions for cooking, they were documents of love expressed through daily care. But instead of throwing the box away, Henry began to see it differently. The cherry wood was beautiful, the construction was sound, and the size was perfect for the custom spice storage he'd been planning for the bus kitchen. Margaret had abandoned these recipes along with everything else from their marriage, but that didn't mean the box couldn't serve a new purpose. The transformation required delicate work. Henry needed to remove Margaret's recipe cards without damaging the wood, then redesign the interior to hold spice bottles and cooking essentials. The project demanded both technical skill and emotional courage. Every recipe card he removed carried memories of happier times, but creating something new from the remnants felt like the most honest form of healing. Henry started by carefully photographing each recipe card, preserving them digitally, even as he cleared them from the physical box. Some recipes he found himself reading completely, remembering the meals they'd produced and the occasions they'd celebrated. Others he set aside quickly, before the memories could overwhelm his resolve. The reconstruction began with measurements precise to 1/16 of an inch. The interior would hold 36 spice bottles in custom-fitted slots, plus dividers for measuring spoons and other small cooking tools. Each compartment required individual planning and construction, turning the simple box into a masterpiece of functional organization. The work progressed slowly, partly because of the precision required, and partly because Henry found himself pausing frequently to deal with the emotional weight of what he was doing. This wasn't just carpentry, it was alchemy, transforming pain into purpose, memory into function. Michael called during one of these pauses, his voice carrying the strain that had become increasingly common in their conversations. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something," Michael began, and Henry could hear Jennifer's voice in the background, offering whispered encouragement. "Jennifer and I have been having some problems lately. Nothing serious, but we're seeing a counselor, and she's been asking about family patterns, about how we learn to handle conflict and disappointment." Henry set down his small plane and gave Michael his full attention. This was the first time his son had opened up about personal struggles since the divorce began. "I keep thinking about how you and Mom handled things," Michael continued. "Or didn't handle things, I guess. The way everything just fell apart without warning. It makes me wonder if I know how to recognize problems before they become disasters." The honesty was unexpected and heartbreaking. Henry realized that his children hadn't just lost their parents' marriage. They'd lost faith in their own ability to maintain lasting relationships. "What does your counselor suggest?" Henry asked carefully. "She says I tend to avoid difficult conversations until they become crises, that I'd rather pretend everything is fine than deal with small problems that might grow into big ones. She thinks I learned that from watching how our family operated." Henry felt the weight of recognition. Michael was right. Henry and Margaret had avoided confronting their growing distance until it became unbridgeable. They'd both chosen comfortable silence over difficult honesty, assuming their love was strong enough to survive without maintenance. "Your counselor sounds wise," Henry said. "What can I do to help?" "I don't know, Dad. Maybe just understanding that this stuff affects more than just you and Mom. Sarah and I are both struggling to figure out how to build relationships that last. When your parents' marriage falls apart after 25 years, it makes you question whether lasting love is even possible." After Michael hung up, Henry sat with his son's words, echoing in the colored light from the stained glass windows. The bus renovation had been his way of rebuilding his life after losing everything that mattered, but he hadn't considered how his children were processing the same loss. They were trying to build their own families while watching the foundation of their beliefs about marriage crumble. Henry returned to work on Margaret's recipe box with renewed purpose. The transformation wasn't just about creating functional storage. It was about demonstrating that broken things could be made beautiful again, that endings could become beginnings if you had the courage to see possibilities instead of just problems. The spice cabinet took 2 weeks to complete. Each compartment was hand-fitted to specific bottle sizes, with cedar dividers that would protect the spices from moisture and insects. The finish was 12 coats of hand-rubbed tung oil that brought out the cherrywood's deep grain and gave it a warm glow that complemented the stained glass windows. When Henry finally loaded the completed cabinet with spices, the transformation was complete. What had once held recipes for a family that no longer existed now organized the tools for creating new meals, new memories, new possibilities. The cherrywood gleamed in the colored light, beautiful in its new purpose. A surprise visitor interrupted his satisfaction with the completed project. Tom appeared at the bus door on a Saturday afternoon, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing work boots that looked like they'd actually been used for work. "Sarah mentioned you might be willing to show me around," Tom said, his genuine interest evident in the way his eyes immediately went to the stained glass installation. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Henry welcomed him inside, pleased by Tom's obvious appreciation for the craftsmanship. Unlike Michael's visit, which had focused on practical concerns, Tom seemed genuinely curious about the techniques and artistry Henry was employing. "This is incredible," Tom said, examining the joint work on the spice cabinet. "My grandfather would have loved this. He always said the difference between a carpenter and a craftsman was whether you took pride in the parts nobody would see." For the next 2 hours, Tom asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to Henry's explanations. He understood why hand-cut joints were stronger than machine-cut ones, why traditional finishes lasted longer than modern alternatives, why the extra time was worth the superior results. "Sarah worries about you living out here alone," Tom said eventually, settling into one of the built-in bench seats Henry had constructed. "But I don't think she understands what you're actually accomplishing. This isn't just a place to live, it's a masterpiece." Henry poured coffee from Tom's thermos into 2 hand-turned wooden mugs he'd crafted from salvaged oak. "What do you see when you look at this project?" Tom considered the question seriously, his eyes taking in the stained glass, the custom cabinetry, the careful integration of modern systems with traditional craftsmanship. "I see someone who refused to let circumstances define him," Tom said finally. "Someone who took the worst thing that happened to him and used it as raw material for creating something beautiful. I see resilience disguised as carpentry." The answer surprised Henry with its insight. Tom saw what his own children had missed, that the bus renovation wasn't about hiding from reality, but about creating a new reality that honored both the past and the future. As winter began its slow retreat toward spring, Henry realized his project was approaching a crucial transition. The basic structure was complete, the major systems were installed, and the artistic elements were taking shape. What remained was the finishing work, the details that would transform a well-built bus conversion into something worthy of the effort he'd invested. But first, he needed to finish the spice cabinet's installation, securing it permanently in place where it would serve its new purpose for years to come. As Henry worked, he thought about Michael's struggles with his marriage and wondered if his son might someday understand that the most important repairs often happen slowly, one careful step at a time, with tools that have been sharpened by generations of patient hands. March brought the kind of warm afternoon that made winter feel like a distant memory. Henry was installing the final pieces of trim around the stained glass windows when his chisel slipped and gouged into what should have been solid metal framework. Instead of the resistance of steel, the blade sank into something that felt hollow. Curious, Henry tapped the area with his hammer and heard an unmistakable echo. There was a hidden compartment in the bus's original framework, a space that his father had somehow incorporated into the structure decades earlier. The discovery sent Henry's pulse racing as he carefully expanded the opening, wondering what Frank Calder might have hidden in the bones of his bus. The compartment was larger than Henry had expected, roughly the size of a shoebox, and sealed against moisture with the same attention to detail that Frank brought to all his projects. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, Henry found a collection that stopped his breath and brought tears he hadn't expected. Letters. Dozens of them, written in the careful cursive of elementary school children, addressed to "the best daddy in the world" and "my hero dad." Michael's 7-year-old handwriting declaring that he wanted to build houses just like his father. Sarah's crayon drawings of their family, complete with stick figures labeled Mommy, Daddy, Michael, and me, standing in front of a house that looked remarkably like the one Henry had built with his own hands. There were report cards that Henry had forgotten existed, both children's academic achievements carefully preserved alongside their artwork and school photos. A Mother's Day card that Sarah had made for Margaret, with a poem about the best mummy who makes the best cookies. A Father's Day tie made from construction paper and decorated with Michael's handprints. At the bottom of the collection, Henry found a letter in his father's familiar script, dated 15 years earlier and addressed simply to Henry. "Son," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means you finally decided to do something with this old bus, just like I always hoped you would. I've been saving these treasures for years, ever since Michael and Sarah started school and began bringing home their creations. Margaret used to laugh at me for keeping everything, but I told her these memories were too precious to throw away. I hid them here because I had a feeling that someday you might need to remember who you were before life got complicated. Children see their parents as heroes until the world teaches them otherwise. These letters and drawings are from back when you were perfect in their eyes, when they believed you could build anything, fix anything, make anything better just by paying attention to it. I don't know what circumstances brought you to this bus, but I'm guessing they weren't easy ones. Life has a way of breaking down even the strongest men, and sometimes we forget that being broken doesn't mean being worthless. Sometimes it just means we're ready to be rebuilt into something better. These children of yours loved you completely once. They believed in you absolutely. That love doesn't disappear just because circumstances change. It just gets buried under disappointment and hurt, and the practical concerns that come with growing up. Your job now is to remind them who you really are, not by telling them, but by showing them. Build something worthy of their childhood faith, son. Build it with the same hands that once seemed magical to them, and maybe they'll remember that magic is real when it comes from love and patience and the willingness to create something beautiful from whatever materials life provides. Your mother and I are proud of the man you became, and we believe in the man you're still becoming. With all my love, Dad. Henry sat in the colored light of the stained glass windows, his father's letter trembling in his hands as 15 years of grief and loss suddenly recontextualized themselves. Frank hadn't just saved these childhood treasures. He'd created a time capsule of unconditional love, preserving the memory of when Henry was his children's hero, when his approval meant everything and his presence made them feel safe in an uncertain world. The children's letters revealed a father Henry had almost forgotten existed. Michael's earnest 7-year-old prose, describing how Daddy fixes everything that's broken and makes it better than new. Sarah's kindergarten artwork showing the two of them working together in his shop, her stick figure carefully positioned next to his, both holding tools and smiling. There were photos, 2 candid shots that Margaret must have taken without Henry noticing. Him teaching Michael to use a hand plane, both of them concentrating intensely on the task. Sarah sitting on his shoulders while he pointed out different types of wood grain. The whole family gathered around a birdhouse they'd built together, everyone beaming with the pride of shared accomplishment. These weren't the strained relationships that characterized his current interactions with Michael and Sarah. These were the bonds that had existed before divorce papers and financial stress, and the disappointments that accumulate when children realize their parents are fallible human beings rather than invincible protectors. Henry read every letter twice, studied every drawing until he could recall the circumstances that had inspired each one. A drawing of their house with smoke coming from the chimney, created after Henry had taught Sarah how to build a proper fire. Michael's detailed description of watching his father repair a neighbor's fence, complete with technical details that showed how carefully the boy had observed every step of the process. "My dad is the strongest man in the world," one letter declared. "He can lift anything and fix anything, and he always knows what to do when something is broken." The irony wasn't lost on Henry. His children had once seen him as the man who could fix anything, and now they thought he was the broken thing that needed fixing. Somewhere between their childhood hero worship and their adult skepticism, the truth about who he really was had gotten lost. But Frank had preserved the evidence. Here, in the children's own words and pictures, was proof that Henry Calder had once been worthy of complete faith and absolute love. More importantly, these treasures suggested that the capacity for that relationship still existed, buried under years of accumulated disappointment, but not destroyed by it. Henry carefully arranged the letters and drawings on his work table, creating a display that would become the centerpiece of what he now realized was more than just a home renovation. This wasn't just about building a place to live, it was about creating a memorial to the father he'd been, and a promise about the father he could still become. The bus renovation took on new urgency as Henry understood its true purpose. He wasn't just building a home for himself, he was creating a physical manifestation of the love these letters and drawings represented. Every hand-cut joint, every carefully selected material, every hours of patient work was an attempt to prove himself worthy of the faith his children had once placed in him. Frank's final gift had been the reminder that love doesn't disappear, it just gets covered over by life's complications. The letters proved that Michael and Sarah had once believed their father could build anything, fix anything, make anything better just by applying his attention and skill to the problem. Now Henry had the chance to prove they'd been right all along. The hidden compartment became a shrine of sorts, carefully restored and lined with cedar to preserve its precious contents. Henry would rebuild it into the bus's design, creating a memory wall that would remind him daily of why this work mattered. Every time doubt crept in, every time the loneliness threatened to overwhelm him, he could look at these testimonies of love and remember that he was building something worthy of the children who had once seen him as their hero. The bus would become more than a home. It would become a testament to the father he'd been and a promise about the father he intended to be again. April arrived with the kind of soft warmth that made every living thing remember what growth felt like. The pasture behind Henry's bus erupted in wildflowers that his father had planted decades earlier, blues and yellows and whites that turned the field into a living canvas. Inside the bus, Henry was putting finishing touches on what had become far more than a renovation project. The discovery of his father's hidden time capsule had transformed Henry's understanding of what he was building. This wasn't just a home, it was a love letter written in wood and glass and metal, addressed to the children who had once believed their father could fix anything. Every detail now carried the weight of that purpose. Henry spent his mornings working on the memory wall, a carefully curated display that would showcase Frank's preserved treasures alongside new elements that told the story of their family's journey. The children's letters and drawings were mounted behind glass, protected but visible, reminding anyone who entered that this space was built on a foundation of love that had survived every disappointment. The centerpiece was a hand-carved frame that held the last truly happy photograph of their family Christmas morning 3 years ago, before anyone suspected that Margaret was already planning her exit, before Henry lost his job, before the world they'd built together began its slow collapse. In the photo, they all looked genuinely content, surrounded by the warmth of the home Henry had built and the traditions they'd maintained for decades. But now the frame told a different story. Henry had carved it from cherry wood salvaged from their old dining room table, the one that had hosted thousands of family meals. The wood grain held memories of birthday celebrations, homework sessions, holiday preparations, and quiet conversations over coffee while the children slept. Transforming that table into a frame for their family photo felt like the most honest form of recycling, turning the furniture of their shared past into art that honored what they'd once meant to each other. The work demanded absolute precision. Each element of the memory wall had to be perfectly positioned, not just for aesthetic reasons, but because this display would be the first thing his children saw when they finally entered the bus. Henry knew he'd get only one chance to show them what he'd built, one moment to prove that their father was still the man who could create something beautiful from broken materials. The invitations required as much care as any piece of furniture he'd ever built. Henry crafted them from handmade paper, using techniques he'd learned decades earlier from a papermaker who taught him that the most important communications deserved the most thoughtful presentation. Each invitation was unique, personalized with details that showed how carefully he'd considered what would matter to each recipient. Michael's invitation acknowledged the stress in his marriage and suggested that seeing the bus project might offer perspective on building something that lasts. Sarah's invitation mentioned Tom's appreciation for traditional craftsmanship and suggested they might both enjoy seeing techniques that were becoming rare in modern construction. The wording was carefully chosen to build anticipation without seeming desperate. Henry wanted them to come because they were genuinely curious about what he'd accomplished, not because they felt obligated to humor their eccentric father. "You've been patient with my project through the winter months," Henry wrote, "and I know it seemed like an old man hiding from reality in a school bus. But I think you'll be surprised by what that old bus has become. Would you be willing to join me for dinner next Saturday? I promise you'll see something that will change how you think about second chances." The invitations went out on a Monday, hand-delivered to ensure they arrived safely. Henry spent the rest of the week preparing the bus for visitors, cleaning every surface until it gleamed, adjusting the lighting to show off the stained glass at its best, and planning a menu that would demonstrate the functionality of his custom kitchen. The responses came quickly. Michael called first, his voice carrying curiosity that hadn't been there in months. "Dad, your invitation was beautiful. Where did you learn to make paper like that? Jennifer's been examining it like it's some kind of artifact." Sarah's text message was more direct. "Tom's been asking about your project for weeks. We'll definitely be there. Should we bring anything?" Both responses carried a tone that Henry hadn't heard from his children since before the divorce. Genuine interest rather than worried obligation. The invitations had accomplished their purpose, creating anticipation instead of dread. Henry spent Thursday and Friday on final preparations, ensuring every system worked perfectly and every detail met the standards he'd set for himself. The solar power system needed testing, the water pumps required adjustment, and the custom lighting had to be positioned to create the right atmosphere for the evening he'd been planning since winter. But as Saturday approached, doubt began creeping in. What if his children were disappointed? What if they saw his work as an elaborate form of avoidance, rather than the act of creation he intended? What if the bus, for all its beauty, just reminded them of how far their father had fallen from the life they'd once shared? Henry found himself standing in the pasture at sunrise on Saturday morning, looking at the bus from the same angle his children would see it when they arrived. The yellow paint had weathered to a soft gold, and the morning light, streaming through the stained glass windows, created patterns on the ground that looked almost magical. Frank's driver's badge, now polished and prominently displayed on the dashboard, caught the first rays of sun and reflected them back like a beacon. This was the moment Henry had been building toward for 8 months, not just the completion of a renovation project, but the chance to show his children that their father was still the man who could create beauty from brokenness, who could take the worst circumstances and transform them into something worthy of admiration. The menu for the evening was carefully planned around dishes that would showcase both the bus's kitchen capabilities and Henry's newfound skills in confined space cooking. He'd learned to prepare complex meals using minimal equipment, and tonight's dinner would demonstrate that the bus wasn't just a place to survive, but a platform for actually living well. More importantly, the meal would be prepared using spices stored in Margaret's transformed recipe box, ingredients grown in the small garden Henry had planted behind the bus, and techniques he'd perfected during long winter evenings when cooking became both necessity and meditation. As the day progressed, Henry made final adjustments to the memory wall, ensuring every piece was perfectly positioned. The children's letters were arranged chronologically, showing the progression of their relationship with their father from early childhood through the pre-teen years, when life was still simple enough for unconditional hero worship. Frank's letter occupied a place of honor at the center of the display, its wisdom about rebuilding broken lives serving as the thesis statement for everything Henry had accomplished. The old man had understood something that Henry was only beginning to grasp, that the most important construction projects weren't about building structures, but about rebuilding relationships. The afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows painted the interior of the bus in jewel tones that made every surface seem to glow. Henry had timed the invitation for late afternoon, knowing that this would be the hour when his work would look its absolute best, when the combination of natural and artificial lighting would create an atmosphere that would take his children's breath away. At 4 o'clock, Henry heard the first car pulling into the drive. Through the bus windshield, he could see Michael's sedan approaching slowly, as if his son was taking time to really look at the property for the first time in months. Behind Michael's car, Sarah's truck followed at a respectful distance, Tom visible in the passenger seat. Henry took a deep breath, checked his appearance in the mirror he'd mounted near the door, and prepared to welcome his children into the world he'd spent 8 months creating. Everything depended on the next few hours, whether the bus would be seen as the masterpiece he intended or just an elaborate form of denial. The sound of car doors closing carried clearly across the pasture. Henry could hear voices, though not words, and the tone suggested curiosity rather than resignation. His children were approaching the bus with an openness he hadn't heard in their voices for months. This was the moment Henry had been building toward since that first morning when he'd found Margaret's wedding ring and decided to transform his shame into something beautiful. The success or failure of 8 months' work would be measured not in the perfection of his joints or the beauty of his stained glass, but in whether his children could see past their father's circumstances to recognize the love that had created every carefully crafted detail. Henry opened the custom-forged door handle and stepped outside to greet the family that had once meant everything to him, and might, if he'd built well enough, mean everything to him again. Michael approached the bus with Jennifer beside him, their expressions carrying the careful neutrality of people prepared to be supportive, regardless of what they encountered. But Henry could see the moment when expectations shifted to surprise. Michael's steps slowed as he took in details that didn't match his assumptions about his father's living situation. The bus looked nothing like the institutional yellow vehicle they remembered from childhood. The exterior had been restored to a warm gold that complemented the landscape, and the stained glass windows caught the late afternoon light like jewels set in the metal framework. Solar panels gleamed from the roof, and a small garden flourished beside the entrance, complete with herbs that filled the air with the scents of basil and rosemary. Sarah and Tom emerged from their truck with expressions of undisguised amazement. Tom immediately began examining the external modifications with the eye of someone who understood construction, pointing out details to Sarah as they approached. The solar installation, the upgraded electrical connections, the subtle reinforcements that had transformed a school bus into something that looked more like a custom-built recreational vehicle. "Dad," Sarah said, stopping 10 feet from the bus entrance, "this is not what we expected." Henry smiled, his nervousness beginning to transform into pride. "I was hoping it might surprise you. Are you ready to see what 8 months of work can accomplish?" Jennifer spoke for the first time since arriving. "Henry, this is beautiful. The windows are extraordinary. Where did you find stained glass like that?" "Salvaged from St. Matthew's before they demolished it," Henry explained, pleased that she'd noticed his proudest artistic achievement. "Seemed like they deserved a second life rather than ending up in a dumpster." Michael walked around to the side of the bus, examining the integration of old and new elements with his accountant's eye for detail. "The workmanship looks professional, Dad. Did you have help with the technical aspects?" "Every bit of it is my own work," Henry said, unable to keep the satisfaction from his voice. "Your grandfather's tools, traditional techniques, and a lot of patience." Tom stepped closer to examine the door handle, running his fingers over the hand-forged metal. "This is incredible craftsmanship. You made this yourself?" Henry nodded, remembering the hours he'd spent at the forge he'd improvised behind the bus, learning to work with hot metal, using techniques that hadn't changed in centuries. The door handle had been one of his most challenging projects, but also one of his most satisfying. It was forged from metal, salvaged from the family's old home, a downspout that had carried rainwater from the roof Henry had built with his own hands. "It's made from pieces of our old house," Henry explained. "Seemed appropriate that it should open the door to my new one." The symbolism wasn't lost on his children. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she understood what her father was telling them, that he'd literally incorporated their shared past into his new beginning, that this wasn't about running away from their family history, but about honoring it in a new form. "Dad," Michael said quietly, "we owe you an apology. We thought you were giving up, hiding from reality. But this..." He gestured toward the bus, taking in the garden, the restoration, the obvious care that had gone into every detail. "This is the opposite of giving up." Henry felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with anxiety, and everything to do with recognition. His son was finally seeing what Henry had been trying to show him for months. This wasn't defeat disguised as a project. This was resilience expressed through craftsmanship. "Would you like to see inside?" Henry asked, his hand on the custom door handle that represented so much more than just an entrance to his home. The four of them gathered at the threshold, their faces reflecting anticipation rather than the polite concern Henry had become accustomed to. This was the moment he'd been building toward, not just the completion of his project, but the chance to show his children that their father was still the man who could create something extraordinary from ordinary materials. Henry turned the handle he'd forged from the bones of their old life and opened the door to the world he'd spent 8 months creating. The late afternoon light, streaming through the stained glass windows, painted the interior in colors that seemed to glow from within. And he heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath as she got her first glimpse of what the old school bus had become. The transformation was complete, and the real test was just beginning. Everything Henry had learned about love, loss, craftsmanship, and redemption was about to be measured in his children's reactions to the home he'd built, not just for himself, but for the possibility of their family finding its way back to each other. The silence that followed their entrance into the bus was the kind that comes when expectations are so thoroughly exceeded that words become inadequate. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth. Michael stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes trying to process details that contradicted everything he'd assumed about his father's living situation. Sarah made a sound that was half gasp, half sob. The interior of the bus had been transformed into a flowing work of art that honored both function and beauty. The stained glass windows cast pools of colored light across polished hardwood floors, while hand-carved cabinetry displayed the kind of joinery that belonged in museums rather than motor vehicles. The kitchen showcased Margaret's transformed recipe box, now a gleaming spice cabinet that caught and reflected the rainbow light from the windows. "Oh my God, Dad," Sarah whispered, stepping deeper into the space with the reverence usually reserved for cathedrals. "This is extraordinary." Tom immediately gravitated toward the woodwork, running his fingers along joints so perfect they seemed to have grown rather than been cut. "This is master-level craftsmanship. I've never seen hand-cut work this precise outside of restoration museums." Henry guided them through the living area, pointing out features that demonstrated both technical innovation and artistic vision. The built-in seating incorporated storage while maintaining elegant proportions. The lighting system used both natural and LED sources to create warmth without harsh shadows. Every surface showed evidence of hand finishing that had required months of patient work. But it was Michael's reaction that surprised Henry most. His accountant son, who usually reduced everything to cost-benefit analysis, stood transfixed by a section of crown molding that had required 3 days to install properly. "Dad, this is furniture-grade work. How did you learn to do this level of detail?" "Your grandfather taught me more than I realized," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "His tools remembered skills I'd forgotten I had." They moved toward the back of the bus, where the bedroom demonstrated Henry's mastery of space efficiency without sacrificing comfort. The sleeping area felt spacious despite the constraints, with built-in storage that utilized every available cubic inch. The bathroom, compact but complete, featured hand-tiled walls and fixtures that looked like they belonged in an upscale hotel. Jennifer, who had said little since entering, finally found her voice. "Henry, this isn't just a place to live. This is a work of art. How long did all this take?" 8 months of full-time work, Henry replied. "Every day, sunrise to sunset. It became more than a project. It became a meditation on what I wanted the rest of my life to look like." But the real moment came when they discovered the memory wall. Henry had positioned it strategically, saving it for last, knowing that this element would either complete his children's understanding of what he'd built or leave them confused about his motivations. Sarah saw it first, her eyes widening as she recognized her own childhood handwriting in the carefully preserved letters. "Dad, where did these come from?" Henry explained Frank's hidden time capsule, watching as his children read their own words from decades earlier, declarations of love and admiration for the father they'd believed could fix anything, build anything, make everything better just by applying his attention to the problem. Michael picked up one of his own letters, written in the careful cursive of a second grader. "I remember writing this. It was after you helped me build that race car for the Pinewood Derby. I was so proud that my dad knew how to make it the fastest one there." Sarah studied a drawing she'd made, showing the two of them working in his shop, both stick figures smiling as they held tools. "I drew this after you taught me to use the hand plane. I thought it was magic, the way you could make wood smooth as silk just by pushing that tool across it." The tears came then, not the polite moisture of nostalgia, but the deep sobbing of recognition and loss and hope, all mixed together. Sarah threw her arms around Henry with the fierce intensity she'd shown as a child, and for the first time in years, he felt like her father, rather than someone she needed to manage. Michael's embrace was more tentative, but equally meaningful. "Dad, I'm sorry we doubted you. We thought you were breaking down, but you were actually building something incredible. This is who you've always been, we just forgot how to see it." Tom and Jennifer stood back respectfully, understanding that they were witnessing a family's rediscovery of itself. The bus had become more than Henry's home. It had become the bridge that connected his children to the father they'd lost somewhere between childhood hero worship and adult disappointment. "The letters prove something important," Henry said, his voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. "They show that the love never disappeared, it just got buried under circumstances and misunderstandings and hurt feelings. But love, this deep, doesn't die. It just waits for the right moment to resurface." As the colored light from the stained glass windows painted them all in blues and golds and roses, Henry realized that his 8-month project was complete in ways he hadn't anticipated. He hadn't just built a home, he'd rebuilt a family's faith in the possibility of second chances, proving that broken things could be made beautiful again by patient hands, guided by enduring love. 6 months after the family reunion in the bus, autumn painted the pasture in shades that reminded Henry of the stained glass windows that had started his transformation. The old school bus had become the heart of something he'd never expected, a gathering place where 3 generations came together to remember what family meant. Michael's marriage had not only survived his crisis, but emerged stronger, built on the foundation of honest communication that his father's example had inspired. Watching Henry rebuild from complete loss had taught Michael that relationships, like fine furniture, required constant maintenance and occasional major repairs. The counseling sessions became less about avoiding disaster and more about building something that would last. "Jennifer and I have been talking about building a workshop behind our house," Michael said, running his hand along a cabinet door Henry had recently completed for a local client. "Not because we need the storage, but because there's something about working with your hands that makes everything else make more sense." Sarah had broken off her engagement to Tom, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Seeing her father's transformation had made her realize that Tom was the kind of man who valued substance over appearance, craftsmanship over convenience. Her new relationship with him was built on deeper foundations, shared values about what made life worth living, mutual respect for work that mattered, and an understanding that the best things were worth waiting for and working toward. "We're planning to get married next spring," Sarah announced during one of their Sunday visits, her engagement ring catching light from the stained glass windows. "Tom wants you to build something special for the ceremony, maybe an arbor? Something that will remind everyone that the best marriages are like the best furniture built to last forever with the right care and attention." Henry's business had grown beyond anything he'd imagined possible. Word of the bus renovation had spread through the community like a slow fire, bringing him commissions from people who valued traditional craftsmanship and didn't mind paying for work that would outlast the current generation. But more importantly, it had brought him apprentices, young people who wanted to learn skills that were disappearing from the modern world. The magazine feature had appeared in early American life, complete with photographs that captured the bus's transformation from institutional yellow to rolling masterpiece. The article focused not just on the technical accomplishments, but on the story behind them. A man who had refused to let circumstances define him, who had used his lowest moment as the foundation for his greatest achievement. But the real measure of Henry's success wasn't in magazine articles or client referrals. It was in the rhythm of Sunday dinners that had resumed in the bus. With Michael's family and Sarah and Tom gathering around the table Henry had built to fit the space perfectly. Jennifer had learned to cook using recipes from Margaret's old collection, now kept in digital form, but prepared with spices stored in the transformed recipe box. The conversations were different now, deeper and more honest than the careful politeness that had characterized their interactions during the dark months after the divorce. Michael talked openly about his struggles with work-life balance, seeking his father's advice about finding meaning beyond financial success. Sarah shared her plans for incorporating traditional arts into her elementary school curriculum, inspired by watching Henry teach neighborhood children basic woodworking skills. "I've been thinking about what makes the difference between surviving hard times and thriving because of them," Henry said during one of these dinners. the autumn light streaming through his stained glass windows, painting them all in warm colors. I think it comes down to whether you use your challenges as excuses or as raw materials. The bus's most recent addition was the family compass, mounted on the dashboard where Frank's driver's badge had once sat alone. Henry had crafted it from brass salvaged from their old house, with a face that showed not magnetic north, but rather home, wherever the bus happened to be parked when family gathered inside it. The compass represented everything Henry had learned about navigation during his darkest year. Home wasn't a place you owned or a structure you built. It was wherever love gathered to create something beautiful from whatever materials life provided. Tom had proven himself worthy of the family's trust, not through grand gestures, but through quiet consistency. He'd spent countless hours in the bus, learning traditional techniques from Henry, approaching the work with the same reverence Henry had learned from his own father. More importantly, he understood that marrying Sarah meant joining a family that measured worth not by income or status, but by the willingness to invest time and care in creating something lasting. "Your father saved our family," Tom told Sarah during one of their working sessions, carefully hand-sanding a piece of cherry wood that would become part of their wedding arbor. "Not by fixing our problems, but by showing us that problems are just opportunities to build something better." The seasonal rhythms that governed Henry's new life brought unexpected satisfaction. Spring meant planning new projects and teaching workshops for young people who wanted to learn skills their schools no longer offered. Summer brought the long days perfect for complex construction and the evening visits from family who stopped by after work to see what Henry was creating. Autumn was for finishing projects and preparing for the quiet contemplation that winter would bring. Margaret had remarried quietly, and her new life with David seemed to bring her the kind of happiness that had eluded their marriage in its final years. She'd sent Henry a letter on the anniversary of their divorce, thanking him for his grace during the difficult transition and expressing amazement at what he'd accomplished with the bus. There was no bitterness in her words, only recognition that some endings create space for better beginnings. "I always knew you were capable of extraordinary things," she wrote. "I just didn't understand that sometimes we have to lose everything we think we want before we can discover what we actually need. The bus is beautiful, Henry, but more beautiful is the father our children found again because you refused to stay broken." The letter had taken Henry by surprise, arriving on a morning when he was installing the final piece of trim around the memory wall. Reading Margaret's words while surrounded by evidence of his children's rediscovered love felt like the completion of a circle he'd been unconsciously drawing for almost 2 years. Winter evenings in the bus had become Henry's favorite time. The stained glass windows looked different by lamplight, more mysterious and contemplative, perfect for the quiet work of hand-finishing details or planning future projects. The wood stove created warmth that seemed to penetrate deeper than mere temperature, the kind of comfort that came from being exactly where you belonged. On one such evening, with snow falling softly outside and his family gathered around the table for their weekly dinner, Henry looked at the compass and realized it was pointing true. Michael was helping his young daughter learn to use a hand plane, guiding her small fingers with the same patience Henry had once shown him. Sarah and Tom were discussing plans for their spring wedding, debating the merits of different wood species for the arbor Henry would build. Jennifer was photographing the evening for the family album she'd started keeping, documenting the new traditions they were creating. This was home, not the building he'd lost or the bus he'd gained, but the love that had survived every challenge and emerged stronger for having been tested. The compass had been calibrated correctly from the beginning. Henry had just needed to learn how to read it properly. "Dad," Michael said, looking up from his daughter's woodworking lesson, "I've been thinking about building something permanent on the property. Maybe a workshop where we could all work together on bigger projects. What do you think?" Henry smiled, watching his granddaughter's intense concentration as she learned to feel the wood respond to properly sharpened tools. 3 generations working together, passing down skills and stories, and the understanding that the most important things in life were built slowly, carefully, with patience and love. "I think that sounds like a perfect next project," Henry said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had learned that second chances weren't given. They were built, one careful joint at a time, by hands guided by hope and hearts that refused to accept that broken meant worthless. Outside, the snow continued to fall on the pasture, where Frank Calder had once dreamed of raising horses. Inside the bus, his son was surrounded by the family he'd rebuilt from the ruins of the family he'd lost, proving that the most important navigation tool wasn't a compass that pointed north, but the wisdom to understand that home was wherever love chose to gather and create something beautiful from whatever materials were at hand. The bus had become exactly what Henry had intended, not just a place to live, but a testament to the possibility of transformation, a rolling masterpiece that carried the best of the past into whatever future his family would build together.